The Edmonton Oilers opening night lineup once seemed like a foregone conclusion, but with the injury to Calvin Pickard over the weekends, there were some question marks now.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So today's edition of Locked On Oilers is going to be all about the roster decisions the Oilers need to make. We're going to go through the contingencies of whether or not Calvin Pickard is available to start the season, what it will mean for the roster if he can't, what it means for the roster if he can. Because as we've discussed ad nauseum all summer, the Oilers do not have a ton of cap space to play with here. Coming into training camp, they were sitting at about $945,000 in cap space, and that was without putting Evander Kane on long-term injured reserve. As we've discussed ad nauseum, the everydayers know, and even if you've only checked in here and there during the course of the summer, we all know the Oilers' defense on paper is lacking. They need to add a defenseman during the course of the season. It'll probably be close to the trade deadline, because the longer the Oilers wait, the more cap space they're going to be able to accrue over the course of X number of days where they have $945,000 in cap space. But Saturday night, you have an accident. You know, that happens where guys will crash the net and the goalie can't get out of the way, and Pickard hits his head on the post and he comes out of the game relatively early. The early accounts are that he's decently okay, that he's going to take a few days off from hockey activities, that he's dealing with some lingering soreness in his neck from the impact of hitting the post. But for the most part, it seems like the Oilers have avoided the worst case scenario. And you don't want to go into an NHL season with one goalie. And look, I understand that the goaltender position is hard to put together, that there aren't 32 starting goalies to begin with. So when we start talking about backups, it gets even more tenuous as far as confidence. But where the Oilers are at, you can survive in the interim. The Oilers have 3 preseason games remaining. They have one tonight, Monday night, one on Wednesday, and then one on Friday. Then the Oilers have Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then next Wednesday will be the day they need to make a decision as to whether or not how they are going to handle their roster. So you need clarity on the duration of his absence. The expectation was that Stuart Skinner would start 2 of these final 3 preseason games. I would assume tonight because he didn't play on Saturday. And then I would assume on Friday as well. You'll see a little bit of the other guys in the mix. You'll see Colin Delia. You'll see Olivier Rodrigue. But you need clarity as to how long Pickard's going to be out, because that is going to impact how you handle your roster going forward, your cutdowns, whatever. And we're going to talk about that in the next segment. But as far as the Oilers as a team in the interim right now, we've discussed a lot that training camp is mostly for the veterans to get themselves up to speed and for any position battles to get sorted out, special teams work, whether or not you're going to work your way onto a power play, a second power play, or a penalty kill. But the good news is the way the preseason is laid out, the way the end of preseason into the regular season is laid out, the Oilers have breathing room. And of course, you never want to see anyone get hurt. That goes without saying. But Pickard getting injured when he does, this is not the end of the world. You know, if this was in the middle of February and the Oilers had, 8 games over the course of like 16 days, that would be a bit more challenging, because the expectation would be a decent chunk of those are going to be back-to-backs, and you never really want to start a starter on both halves of a back-to-back if you can help it, especially someone like Stuart Skinner, who I'm not going to say is frail, but he's still working into that starter mold, as in bell cow style. The expectation is probably that Stuart Skinner is going to start 50 to 55 games this regular season. That leaves you about 27 starts you're going to need from the backups, whether that's Pickard, Rodrigue, or D'Elia, whoever it is. You're going to need close to 30 starts from non-Stuart Skinner entities this year. So Skinner is reasonably fresh. We have seen this problem creep up on teams a lot in this last five I would say 5-year window, where as we've gotten more efficient in terms of our salary cap spending, and we'd rather have the cheap young guy who might be able to be better than he is than overpaying for experience based on just experience. You know, that middle class of goalie in their late 20s and early 30s who has 20 to 50 NHL starts, who can start in a pinch, those guys aren't in abundance the way they used to be. But sitting here now, the Oilers will know within a few days how far along Pickard is. The games being spaced out the way they are in the preseason, the fact that you're able to carry as many players as you want in the preseason, that doesn't make this a killer. That does not really hurt the Oilers' preseason projections. Yes, you would like Pickard to be able to get work as part of his ramp-up process, as we've discussed a lot over the last 2 weeks. It's essential, more so than anything, just to get these guys live game reps against another team. You can never simulate a game environment in practice, and inter-squad stuff is never going to have the same intensity or violence to it that you're going to have in a regular season hockey game. And without that, I feel guys aren't ready for the regular season as much as they could be. The one last thing I wanted to get in on this first segment before we move on and start talking about the dollars and cents of it all is the Oilers roster, pretty set in stone. You know, we're talking about 3 guys auditioning for defenseman spots. We're talking about 3 guys pushing for a 4th line center spot. But other than that, the roster is relatively set. And like we talked about last week, some guys are not going to get the fairest of shake in terms of evaluation of their preseason performance, because the Oilers need to be conscientious of waivers eligibility and whether or not a player needs to clear waivers to go back down to the AHL. For a guy who's waiver exempt, and that's going to be the bulk of what we talk about in the next segment, if you're waivers exempt, you have to have a tremendous training camp. Because let's say you're Noah Phillip, who has looked really good so far in the preseason after not playing hockey for a year. The reason you're probably not making the team isn't because you don't deserve to. It's because that you would need to waive Corey Perry or you would need to waive Derek Ryan, and you don't want to do that. I don't know necessarily whether or not Corey Perry gets claimed off of waivers based on him going on waivers last year when the Blackhawks bought him out and nobody claiming him, but you don't want to add volatility. You don't want to add risk to your plan. The Oilers added the pieces they did in the offseason with a specific vision for putting their roster together in mind. Now, it's a bit tenuous. There are some question marks. That 4th line and the bottom half of the defense, frankly, are all valid to question. But the more volatility you add, we want to reward Noah Phillip for a really strong preseason. We waive Corey Perry. What does that do for us? If Corey Perry gets claimed, what does that do to our calculus? Can we afford to lose Corey Perry for the entire season? Can we afford to lose Derek Ryan for nothing on waivers? But we are going to take our first break of today's episode. When we come back, we are going to dive into those dollar and cents decisions. We'll talk about LTIR. We'll talk about non-roster LTIR. Talk about Corey Perry. We'll talk about Evander Kane. A whole lot coming up on this edition of Locked On Oilers. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Gametime. You're like me, you love going to events. Last week, I went to an AEW show. Upcoming weeks, I've got another concert on deck, and the only place I buy tickets to get out there to concerts, or if you're excited about hockey, and if you want to get out there to go to an Oilers game, check out Gametime with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience. My personal favorite, the panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. If you're going to a hockey game, you want to get an idea of the sight lines. What parts of the ice do you not have a good vision of? If you're getting to a playoff baseball game, you want to see balls and strikes. You want to know if the umpire's out of his mind or not. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Thank you to everyone who's hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. Hopefully you are beating the Monday existential dread that we're all facing on a Monday, because we're very far from the weekend, friends. But the Oilers are at an interesting decision point, because as we've discussed, the Oilers are actually not doing long-term injured reserve cap shenanigans. They could opt to do that with Evander Kane. The early reports and the early thought is Kane will probably be ready to start doing hockey activities to ramp up to return to play sometime in January. And that's a well of a ways off. But for example, let's say the Oilers did end up putting Evander Kane on LTIR even before this Pickard situation. In doing that, the Oilers would be allowed to spend over the cap to the amount of money Evander Kane is owed. But when you dip into long-term injured reserve money, you do not accrue cap space the way we've talked about of that money counting over month to month, day to day, because the way cap hits are calculated is you divide out the player's cap hit divided by 180, and then the number of days they're on the roster. That's what gets charged at the end of the season. But that's what allows teams to take on players who are making $6 or $7 million at the deadline, because they're only going to pay the cap hit for the number of days they're on the roster. So if you were to put Evander Kane on long-term injured reserve, you're not going to accrue cap space. Sure, you could roster a third goalie, you could roster a 13th forward, you could do both, frankly, for the $5 million or so Evander Kane is owed this upcoming season against the cap. You absolutely could roster D'Elia or Rodrigue and Noah Phillip or James Hamblin or Josh Brown or whomsoever, or Troy Stetcher, whatever you want. You would be able to do that. But being that the Oilers know they are going to need as much cap space as they can possibly manufacture at the trade deadline, you really only want to dip into LTIR money as a choice of last resort. You only want to do that as a break in case of emergency, because that will limit what you are able to do at the trade deadline if you don't have as much cap space to add on players. And Pickard is going to probably be okay to start the regular season, but the Oilers do need to make a decision by 3 o'clock on October 7th. That is when the rosters are due to the league. The options the Oilers have right now, they wait it out and see. They've got, a week. It's September 30th on the day we're recording this, and you've got till October 7th. Maybe in a week, Pickard's fine, and this isn't even a consideration at all, and everything's good to go. But this is something they had to do last year. You put Pickard on non-roster long-term injured reserve. He would count against the salary cap, but being that the Oilers need to dress a backup goalie, that money of the backup goalie counts against the cap every day they're on the roster. The Oilers have $945,000 in cap space right now, rostering a third goalie while Pickard is on non-rostered long-term injured reserve. That means no money. That means no matter what, you are going to have maybe $200,000 to $100,000, depending on how much you're paying Rodrigue or D'Elia on the NHL rate. I know for some of these contracts, the money they're physically owed is different, AHL versus NHL, especially for guys like this. But Rodrigue has no NHL experience at all. He has 66 games of AHL experience. Colin D'Elia has 52 games of NHL experience over several NHL seasons. It's a good thing the Oilers don't need a long-term backup for this season, that this isn't a serious injury to Pickard, because if either of these guys was your full-time backup to Stuart Skinner, you would be nervous. And it might sound a bit unfair to characterize two guys who just haven't played a lot as unreliable, but without knowing what you're going to get to begin with, and the volatility on the Oilers roster itself, where we're going to have Ty Emberson on a second pair, who, look, I liked what I've seen so far in the preseason. He doesn't have a lot of experience. There are going to be growing pains. And then that third pair, whether it's Stetcher, whether it's Josh Brown with Brett Kulak, Stetcher hasn't played since February of last year, March of last year, and Josh Brown has never really been a particularly effective player at the NHL level. that is the conundrum you are facing right now if you're the Oilers. And one other component of this, you like being able to have that 13th forward, and that's the argument for Noah Phillip making the opening night roster and why you hope Pickard is okay. Because then that provides you a little bit of flexibility in your lineup. And I talked about this the other day, and I've hammered this point a lot. I don't think Corey Perry's an everyday guy anymore. I don't think Derek Ryan is an everyday guy anymore at their respective ages. That's not a knock on them. That's just being honest. At some point, those guys are not going to be as physically ready to go as they need be, and they're going to need spells in their workload. They are going to need games off here and there to feel ready to go, as recharged as 100% as you can be during the course of a season. And that's the argument for Noah Phillip making the opening night roster. Shot out of a cannon, lots of energy, younger guy, and you can use him to spell Ryan, to spell Perry, and break up that workload a little bit. And it has a trickle-down effect of rewarding a young player, showing everybody that training camp is an opportunity to prove yourself. One other thing I did want to get in on this second segment. If Pickard has to start the season on non-roster LTIR, that entirely eliminates Travis Dermott from the conversation. I know we're all pretty sure Mike Hoffman's not making the team. I didn't think that from the outset, but especially now with the salary considerations at play here, I don't think there's a world where you can roster either of those guys if Pickard starts the season on non-roster LTIR. And look, I didn't understand the Josh Brown signing when it happened. Even now, 2-3 months removed from that signing, I still don't really see why they did that. I don't think Joshua Brown is an NHL caliber defenseman on a good team. Sure, he could play on a bad team, but the Oilers, there's a high expectation here. The Oilers expect to be competing for a Stanley Cup this season, and Joshua Brown is not that caliber of player. I struggle to see the fit beyond being a direct penalty kill replacement for Vincent Desharnais. But like we talked about last week with penalty killing and Podkolzin, you don't need to just have bodies. You can have functional hockey players on your penalty kill, and that's going to open things up. And look, I understand they're reluctant to put Troy Stetcher on a penalty kill, reluctant to put Ty Emberson on a penalty kill. You're going to need these guys to make some things happen for you. You are going to need these guys to maybe play a bit above their weight, but that's the consideration you have to have when you put together a roster with so much volatility at the bottom half. And look, all of this might be for moot. I want to reiterate that point. There's a chance Pickard is fine by the roster deadline on October 7th, and everything's squared away. And Pickard makes the opening night roster, and then they do have that option of, well, do we want to roster Noah Phillip and use him as our 13th forward, and then we can rotate him in and out with Perry and Derek Ryan? Do we want to give Travis Dermott a two-way contract and have him on the roster as a 7th defenseman? The Oilers have options, which is not bad, but the Oilers do need to make decisions, which creates volatility, which creates the opportunity for a sliding doors of, well, man, we made the wrong decision in rostering Josh Brown over Travis Dermott, or what have you, or rostering Noah Phillip over another or James Hamblin over one of someone else. And there are options, which is good, but you do have to make decisions eventually. We're going to take our final break on today's show, and we're going to run down the contingencies of what can happen, what can't happen, what paths the Oilers have open to them. And we'll wrap up today's show right after this quick break. Today's episode is also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where you can start the NFL season with a big return at America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Last night, the Ravens, a proper can of butt kicking against the Buffalo Bills. Tonight, we got a Monday Night Football doubleheader. The Tennessee Titans going to Miami to take on Tyler Huntley and the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins 2.5-point home favorites. Then the later kickoff, the Seattle Seahawks going to Detroit. The Seahawks, who've gotten off to a nice start with Geno Smith taking on the defending NFC North champion Detroit Lions. The Lions 4.5-point home favorites. I might be in on Seattle tonight based on how Detroit played against Tampa Bay last week. My favorite game of the upcoming week, though, and this one is fun. The Arizona Cardinals going to the San Francisco 49ers. The Cardinals 7.5-point road underdogs. I really like that's a big number. A lot of teams can't cover 8. We'll see what the 49ers are looking like health-wise later in the week, and we'll circle back. That's FanDuel.com to get in on the fun. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are walking through every step of the Calvin Pickard contingency plan. So, as we've discussed, first of all, there is a decent chance Pickard is okay. We will have a better idea of that as the week progresses. They said he was going to take a few days away from hockey activity. They were going to revisit that soreness in his neck in a few days and go from there. If he's okay, we're good. There's nothing else to talk about. We know our roster. And then it's simply, do we want Noah Phillip? Do we want a 7th defenseman? And those are considerations. Those are options you have. Now, if Pickard is unable to start the season, D'Elia or Rodrigue starts the season on the roster as a backup. Unquestioned. You need 2 goalies every night. You cannot go into the season with just Stuart Skinner on the roster. So if you roster D'Elia or Rodrigue because Pickard has to go on non-roster LTIR, the Oilers cannot roster a 13th forward or a 7th defenseman as long as that third goalie is here and as long as Pickard is on non-roster LTIR. Once Pickard comes off of non-roster LTIR, the Oilers would be able to send that third goalie down to the AHL, and that would free up the cap space to bring us back up to the $945,000. Now, if Pickard can start the season, that almost entirely eliminates the possibility of Noah Phillip and Raphael Lavoie from making the roster for money reasons. Not because they didn't deserve to be here, not because they haven't performed well in the preseason, but simply because the Oilers cannot roster that roster configuration of forwards, defensemen, and goalies and be cap compliant. Noah Phillip is waivers exempt, which makes him likely to get sent down. It's not that he hasn't played well, but because of the waiver situation, he is probably going to get sent down. And look, it's a great story. It's very exciting. It's awesome that he has come back and he looks very comfortable for somebody who didn't play competitive hockey last year. But, and I say this with everyone, you can never have enough conditioning work. If Noah Phillip wants to get 20, if the Oilers want to give Noah Phillip 20, 30 games in Bakersfield to ramp himself back up, and then we revisit this conversation around, say, Christmas, and then he's the 13th forward that rotates in and out with Perry and Derek Ryan, that's great. That's perfect. That is not a bad range of outcomes, because then once he comes back up, he can still be sent back down later in the season if need be. That's number one. Number two, ideally, Pickard is cleared to play by next week. They don't need to put anyone on LTIR. There's no roster shenanigans, and you have your pick. Do you want James Hamblin? Do you want Noah Phillip? Do you want Raphael Lavoie? Those are the choices. That is what it comes down to. And the Oilers are lucky, and this is something I talked about with Gil Martin on Locked On NHL on the national show on Monday. The Oilers have a very fragile roster configuration right now. Only having $940,000 in cap space going into the season, they can roster one extra player. Do you have room for one extra player without dipping into LTIR? And look, if the Oilers have the injury bug, they have the year from hell, they're going to have to dive into LTIR to field a team. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like, as much as they want to accrue cap space, as much as they want to be in play for a defenseman at the trade deadline, if the Oilers have 2-3 players that are injured all at the same time, then we have to be realistic here, and we need to survive to get to the point that the trade deadline becomes about adding a useful, a functional piece, as opposed to making an in-season trade to try and get enough guys to fill out the roster to still be competitive. The Oilers do not have a ton of room for error, especially on the back end. And when you are dealing with a position group that is only 6 deep, you don't have a lot of room. None of the Oilers' defensive prospects scream, I'm ready to go right now. None of the obvious waivers. And look, there are going to be useful NHL players who get put on waivers over the next few weeks. And the Oilers, if there's a person that tickles their fancy, should absolutely be in play for adding one, because you can never have enough. You've heard me say it all summer. The Oilers will probably go through upwards of 30 players over the course of an entire season. We're starting the year with 18 on the actual game day roster. You'll have one or two extras if Pickard is good to go. And with that in mind, you're going to have guys miss a game here or there. You are going to see some games from Noah Phillip, probably from James Hamlin, probably from Raphael Lavoie, probably at some point during the season from Matthew Savoie. You will see guys get opportunities because injuries happen. This is a dangerous sport. Miles add up, dings and bruises become tears and strains. As the season goes along, guys start their tank with less and less. And as the season goes along, you are going to need that spot start, probably from an Olivier Rodrigue or a Colin Delia or a James Hamlin or a Noah Phillip. But that is why you cover all your bases. And the Oilers are putting a lot in the air right now. The Oilers are banking on having a good injury season, and they did not have. They had pretty good injury luck last year. If you go through and look, I know Ekholm started the year dinged up. I know McDavid started the year dinged up. Darnell Nurse, Evander Kane finished the year dinged up. But relatively speaking, you didn't lose a lot of man games last year. And year over year, that's typically not the case. So the Oilers need to be mentally prepared for the gymnastics of putting together a roster if that injury luck doesn't come back around, if it's a difficult injury year and the Oilers needed to manage a lot of different, they're juggling a lot of different things, it becomes more of an effort to survive as opposed to just accruing as much cap space as possible. Because look, of course you'd love to trade for like Jacob Chikrin at the trade deadline. You'd love to trade for a William Borgen at the trade deadline. But if you don't have the money to acquire them, that means you got to send money out, which takes away from your roster. If you're taking away from your roster, you're creating a new hole by filling another hole. It is difficult. It is why being an NHL general manager requires short, medium, and long-term planning. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So before we get out of here, if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live. Hit the like button on this given video. Let me know, what do you want the Oilers to do roster-wise? If Calvin Pickard can't start the season, do you have a preference between Colin Delia or Olivier Rodrigue? Do you care about Noah Phillip or James Hamlin? Do you have a preference of those two guys? Do you think Corey Perry and Derek Ryan are going to be every game guys? And before we get out of here, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. Now for your second listen, go find Locked On NHL, where the local experts keep you updated daily on all the biggest storylines ahead of the season. Find Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.